and it's really like 50 years of social sciences, is say we tend to think of someone that disagrees with us and the things that we're pursuing as they are an annoyance, an irritant, and an obstacle, as opposed to they are the thing that is basically increasing the likelihood that we're going to make better decisions, think more effectively, and actually be more creative. And so I did want to stick these two words that don't go together. Principled, you know what matters most to you. And then this rebelliousness of some convention and tradition that's happening is a little bit wrong and no one's discussing it sufficiently.
Todd, welcome to Discover More.
Hey, great to be here.
So during our discovery call, you shared something as an author that I've never heard before. You aim for 80% reviews and satisfaction from the readers. Can you elaborate?
Yeah. I think one of the big difficulties of someone who's trying to educate people, offer advice, mentorship, is you yourself are looking for approval. You are comparing yourself to the other people that are actually your competitors or other courses they could take or workshops they could take, books they could read. And for me, one way of escaping this barrier to well-being is assuming that you will not match the personality profile of a small segment of people. And that if you're aiming at this threshold of 80%, 1 out of 5 people aren't going to like you, like your content, you are freed to actually be a little bit more creative, fewer constraints.
So I think you use the word well-being. And as you know, we're in this current oversaturated wellness and healing and spirituality and whatever language you want to slap on that's been hijacked. How do you define well-being in this container?
Well, for me, I view it as a psychological profile with a lot of dimensions. So you can think of 7 psychological wonders: equanimity, happiness, purpose in life, sense of fun and adventure, exploratory tendencies, psychological flexibility, maturity, and maybe you could add some relevance to love and be loved, your positive relationships. So it's really like those broad range of dimensions. How are you faring on each one of them and across the board?
I think happiness is catch-all terms, right? And of course, it's elusive and it's clusters of symptoms. Just like as you talked about, well-being is 7 wonders of the psychological profiles, and it's a clusters of different things. Just like depression is not just low mood or apathy. It's clusters of symptoms. But why do you feel like it's important to define what well-being is? Because it's not just a singular thing that people can chase after, because it's like that dangling carrot people are always chasing after, but it's always elusive.
Well, there's a few reasons. One of them is you can think of the icons. So I always talk in classes about Martin Luther King that you don't find photographs of him holding a baby, laughing hysterically, riding on his bicycle, with one leg in the air. He was pretty low on joviality, on just that state of happiness, but he was off the charts on a sense of mission and purpose in life. And just that illustration alone is there's always trade-offs. He sacrificed his own happiness, being a Black man fighting for civil rights and for future generations. And you wouldn't want to copy him in terms of the frequency of positive to negative emotions. You would want to dissect his life to figure out how exactly did he find a purpose and then sustain it for such a long period of time.
So I want to go into that, right? The trade-offs. Right? Because one thing I learned in my experiences is it's equilibrium, right? I realized even in my marriage with my wife, my strength that attracted her to me the first place is now my weakness. I'm very assertive, I'm very outgoing, I'm very outspoken, I'm very articulate. But my articulation is a double-edged sword when we're arguing, because I know where it hurts and I'm working on that, right? But why is it important to tell people that there's trade-offs? Because people tend to see the shiny squirrels and not the underlying trade-offs and sacrifice.
Yeah, I think the best place to start with that is to think of what are the most important currencies that you have at your disposal. So it's going to be energy, time, attention, and finances. Anything that you buy is something you're not doing now or saving for later. Anything you devote energy towards, even, and we will probably get into this about curiosity and being intrigued by novel things, means you're using cortical energy. You have only a certain amount at a given point in time that's available. And as you're attending to someone else and what intrigues you about them, there are other things you're not paying attention to in the exact same room. And it's good to think about this at the moment because it's easy to get your hands around, and then to think about your life, that there's no such thing as balance between work, friends, family, parenting, or taking care of the next generation. And so what now, based on what you care most about, are you willing to sacrifice a tiny bit for the thing that you care slightly more about?
Can you expand? What do you mean by there's no balance? Because there's always constant present, future, past.
I mean, if you think about this as a seesaw, is two perfectly even weights to keep it in the exact same parameter in the air. It is a small, minuscule amount of moments in a given month where everything is kept in balance. If you were just to think about these few life domains, work, family, take care of your mind and body, and then parenting or generativity to other generations. Now, the thought experiment for everyone listening to this is try to think of one moment where all those things were perfectly balanced. And what I would argue is just like the 80% rule in terms of seeking approval. Don't aim for balance. Just be sure that the task that you're devoting yourself to in a given day, that you're putting the big priorities first and you're putting out fires.
So I kind of want to use that and go into one of the questions from your books. And it kind of blew my mind, right? So you talked about Charles Darwin, obviously the forefounder of evolutionism and the fitness of fit, all that theories. But you talked about he was not the first. He's just the one that broke through the emotional resistance and cognitive resistance by being a principled rebel. But before that question, I just want to ask you to quickly define what principled rebel is, because I think you're talking about the balance. How do we balance the current landscape, intellectually or otherwise? How do we balance our pursuit of truth and our intellectual curiosity? But to go backwards, like, what does principled rebel mean? Because that's another oxymoron.
You tend to have this view over the course of history is that someone that breaks rules and conventions is to be evaluated negatively. And one thing that we know over the course of human history, much less the social sciences, is that often people rebel not because they don't like the group or the society they're a part of, because their identity is so heavily woven with that society or that group that they care so much about its health and its longevity. And that when it goes the wrong direction and the wrong way, I can't help but speak out. I'm willing to risk and sacrifice my own personal well-being, knowing that for the longer time span of I want this group to function well and be the type of thing that's the aspirational unit that I wanted to be a part of in the first place. And so the first thing that I wanted to do with this work, and it's really like 50 years of social sciences, is say we tend to think of someone that disagrees with us and the things that we're pursuing as they are an annoyance, an irritant, and an obstacle, as opposed to they are the thing that is basically increasing the likelihood that we're going to make better decisions, think more effectively, and actually be more creative. And so I did want to stick these two words that don't go together. Principled, you know what matters most to you. And then this rebelliousness of some convention and tradition that's happening is a little bit wrong and no one's discussing it sufficiently.
So going to the question, how was Charles Darwin one of the most successful principled rebels in the academic history?
From the lens of diversity, there were so many people from so many countries, from the Middle East and from Asia, much less from like small islands and, on the outskirts of Europe, that came to this concept first about evolution. The thing that Darwin did was he realized during the 1800s, it was such a religious society. It was such a creed that the world and humanity was bestowed upon us because of a supernatural power. That the idea of challenging that zeitgeist to say that maybe incrementally and gradually over time, things change slightly. And then those things that changed actually are helpful, actually last longer in the pool. That idea was heresy. So he waited. Among the many things he did was he figured, let me wait until people are ready to be open and receptive to these ideas. And he let a number of authors publish works first that received all the negative criticism that he anticipated. And only then in the 1890s or 1850s did he decide to publish his own work on evolution.
So can we zoom in on that? Based on your book, right? What are like a list of ingredients and successful strategies that he actually utilized? You mentioned patience. You mentioned delegation of ownership in a certain degree. Of course, as academics, there is this ownership, and academia, generally speaking, is a pretty egoic field because intellectuals compete with intellectuals. But if you can produce like a list of ingredients and strategies that allow Darwin to actually succeed with his attempt.
Yeah, sure. No, I'm so glad you're diving into this. Okay, so you're talking about 1859. He reveals the origin of species. That's his tome on evolution. Everything you think about evolutionary psychology, evolutionary science, it starts with this book. First thing he does, which is most important, is makes this a group project. So he brings in, who are my allies? Let me allow them to get some credit for this work. Let them speak for me because I'm not a good orator. That's not my strength. And so I'm going to compensate for my strength for not only bringing people as collaborators on this thing called evolutionary science, but I'm going to leverage their strengths in situations that I can't defend myself. So you have Darwin's bulldog, and that's basically Aldous Huxley's father, who basically is an amazing orator, has great rhetorical skills, and is extremely good in arguing. Darwin was depressogenic. It's hard as a psychologist to go back to say he had recurrent chronic depressive episodes. But if you read his writings, you can make a decent assessment of that. He was not comfortable being rejected. He is challenging the entire worldview that maybe God isn't responsible for everything here. And then maybe humans evolved. He alludes to it. And so if you're challenging the world and everyone in it who's an intellectual elite at the time, you better be able to handle criticism well and be able to dish it out because you're going to get some friction and you're going to get some noise. And he had his bulldogs that would go to scientific conferences and speak for him. The other thing on this list is he really was one of the first scientists to do a trade book, which is, I want to make this in a way so that if you didn't get your PhD in molecular science or botany or biology, this will grab you. So he would create these beautiful, descriptions of pigeons and how they interact with each other and squirrels. And he would talk about, barnacles as these living creatures that all that green gook on the bottom of a boat is that actually it's not the same thing over the course of generations. It's changed. And so him bring you in speaking, you might have thought of the barnacle as like this one green mess that you try to kick off your boat. If you look closely at it, ... And that was not a style that people used prior to Darwin.
I think the undercurrent of that is one of the theses of your book, one's ability to move through and overcome emotional resistance. So can you define what emotional resistance is per your definition? And why is that something that all of us, whether it's author, persuaders, orators, or whatever, even everyday folks, why is it something, a key concept we should grapple with? Because everything is emotions.
Yeah, you have to assume unless you match the beliefs and values and thoughts of someone exactly, which is nobody on earth, then when you raise an idea that's going to be a little bit tangential, have like a 0.7 correlation as you and I talk, there might be some resistance that appears, some disgruntlement about that missing bit of details where you have some thoughts, I haven't thought about it yet, or I disagree with it. And you might not hear their criticism, but you're at least going to get the nonverbals, or at least going to get the pauses that says, you said something that I have yet to be able to nod my head or say, Todd, that was such a good insight that you had there. So that's your low level tension, which is you brought something in that people haven't properly thought about before. On the other extreme, high levels of tension is you get your blues and reds in the United States communicate with each other, which is two different views of how the country operates. And you're going to differ on immigration, differ on what the wages would be kind of for entry level employees, to what degree should people have a safety net in terms of maternal care or being older in life and no longer working anymore. So these are really important issues. And if you discuss them with anybody who disagrees with you on this topic, you can expect some degree of resistance. And so one of the things that's essential to being principled and dissenting or disagreeing or rebelling is that you have to develop the mental fortitude to handle rejection, evaluation, and unfortunately, in the online world, trolls.
Yeah, so speaking of trade book that Darwin developed, if you were to develop a trade book to, as you said, to strengthen one's mental fortitude, what are some of the steps and beautiful descriptions and pictures would you include in that trade book?
So I'll give you even a more close to heart example. I'm preparing a brand new talk right now on curiosity for about 2,000 educators. And instead of starting with the science, I am debating whether to starting of who would you want to be and why? Would it be the Fonz from Happy Days or Richie Cunningham? And then I describe a little bit detailed. There'll be a picture of the two of them on the screen, imagine. And I just talk about how the Fonz, he wore this leather jacket. Every woman in the diner loved him, would come over, wanted to touch him and just be near him, kick a vending machine, the soda pops right out. Just quintessentially cool character that we all would love to be a little bit. Richie Cunningham has this great, loving, caring family, but he's a relative nobody as he goes into the diner or in school. And the question is, who would you want to be and why? And it's not that your answer matters. What matters is, what if you thought about curiosity as directing it outward and inwardly and constantly oscillating between the two? And all this whole discussion about do you want to be the Fonz or Richie Cunningham is to set up a conversation of maybe curiosity is best understood as a reprioritization device to think about what do we care about? What do we want to attend to? Why do we want to attend to it? And to use that as a lens to go through the science without ever mentioning any scientific study.
I think a lot of people don't realize this, but I've learned this through my podcasting journey for the past nearly 5 years, is curiosity requires humility as a prerequisite. Because for me to have you on or anyone on the podcast, aside from your amazing, funny book, I have to first internalize and accept the truth that I have something to learn from you. In this case, a lot. And that's humility. And I realize, especially in LA, most people don't ask questions. They talk about themselves, right? And because that's realized, I have to have the humility to be curious. And because I think humility leads to curiosity, and for mental health lens, curiosity leads to healing. That healing could be emotional healing, mental healing, or just social healing. Reconciliation that you alluded to with the red and the blue, right? Because I feel like creating this relationship or connecting the bridge between the left and the right in the United States is harder than slaying a dragon, right? And dragon's a mystical creature, so that's really hard. But yeah, what are your thoughts about humility as being the prerequisite to curiosity, or any thoughts that you have?
Yeah, and by the way, thank you for the compliment about the book built in there. So for me, I often describe it as the psychological strength holy triad. And you hit two of the three. So curiosity, intellectual humility. And then the third one for me is, which is embedded in what you said, perspective getting and taking. And so if you go back to the Darwin conversation from earlier, why was Darwin creating these metaphors about pigeons and how they interact with each other and barnacles, that they're actually these living, interesting creatures? Is he's taking the perspective of an animal, anthropomorphism, and then offering it to the reader, but not offering it as that I'm the expert to give you something. I was like, you're going to be as amazed as me as I spent 10 years on a boat near the Galapagos to try to understand barnacles. And so he has what you're describing. So by using this triad, this holy triad, he's showing his humility by saying, I bet you're going to be as amazed as I was, because I didn't know any of this stuff beforehand. And he's intrigued and curious. And then he's showing you why this is so interesting. And then the third part of perspective getting, you can't interact directly with your reader because they don't get to give you feedback immediately as you're writing the book. But he's imagining the conversation. What would work if I was in conversation at an Irish pub? And he chose that perspective. And that's taking that psychological strength triad. I think you could break that down into, this is some of the gifts that Darwin used. And the beauty of that, when you really disassemble our iconic characters, the Martha Grahams and the Rosa Parks and the Malalas and the Darwins, is that you realize any of us could do what they did, because these psychological strengths are distributed nicely throughout the world.
Can you zoom in? Have you personally deployed his strategy of imagining or anticipating some sort of a resistance or receptivity? And did you also sort of zoomed out to a third person POV when you're writing this book? Because as you said, you're going for the 80% and you sort of challenge the readers throughout the book to sort of not resist, but sort of sit with it and think about and process the concepts. But what were your some of your process when approaching this book, talking about what you just shared?
So one of the chapters that I knew I wanted to have in there was the woman who basically helped race relations the most 100 years before Rosa Parks. And it was really a really challenging chapter to write, because here I am, this white Jewish middle-class guy, and I want to write about basically a bunch of iconic, heroic Black women in the course of American history that were forgotten. It's like a Christopher Nolan movie, like Memento or Tenet. I wanted levels of this book to show you a principled rebel, Rosa Parks, and say, but guess what? She didn't even know she was standing on the shoulders of Elizabeth Jennings 100 years before. And you probably weren't taught her name in grade school, or especially even in Black History Month. And so I get to share and amplify her voice. And so I use the Darwinian strategies, which was, I discovered her as researching this book. Let me find a story that no one's shared before and amplify a voice of a rebel who hasn't before. And I'm going to share the story with as much emotional power as it was for me to discover it myself. So you can feel like what I felt when I was like, how is nobody talking about Elizabeth Jennings? And now you can see right now as we're talking, I'm not giving any details about her. Her life is so fascinating. And it's like a movie teaser for someone to Google and learn more about who is this woman, Elizabeth Jennings.
Yeah, if my memory served correctly, she was in New York City, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's the teaser. You got to get the book to find out more. But I do want to zoom in on when you said all of us stand on the giants of someone else or those who came before us. Samely for podcasting, some digital flowers to Tim Ferriss and Joe Rogan. Huge inspirations that catalyzed my podcasting journey 5 years ago. And that's the reason why I've shared this offline with friends. I don't believe in self-made. It's not a thing. None of us are self-made. Even if you're born into a lower class without certain privileges, you still have the benefits of informations or those who helped you along the way, or experiential wisdom from those who came before you. That's why in Asian culture, we have this reverence for elders. Even if we disagree with their outdated beliefs, their resistance with mental health or whatever, you still have to accept that they offered and they contributed a lot along the way. So do you have any thoughts about why we're not self-made and why we need to first accept that all of us stand on the giants of some form?
Yeah, I mean, you start with the genetic contribution to every desirable outcome in humanity. So choose happiness, choose ambition, choose high performance and success at work, choose healthy relationships, choose having really good teeth. Having healthy white teeth where the enamel lasts into your 80s without requiring surgery. And the biggest contributor is genetics. It's not all the things that you could purchase that tries to, as someone tries to keep on offloading new things for you to pay for from your dentist. So that alone is, however you feel, most of us in the US do not have this really strong connection, unfortunately, with our ancestral relations. And in terms of, Cambodia and Laos and Libya and, in South Korea, these are areas of the world where you're really tied to 2, 3, 5, 10 generations behind you. But if we think from a behavioral genetic standpoint, immediately is all of the things that are good about you. You've got a good chunk of it is due to your ancestors meeting with each other. And so you could start from there if you're a really hardcore materialist and scientist and say, you're standing on the shoulders. The reason that I can articulate things and process information quickly is because of a bunch of extemporaneous thinkers over the course of generations on my mom's side and my dad's side. And doesn't mean that it's not a malleable trait, but the basic Lego blocks, the early foundations, is there's no tabula rasa, there's no empty slates. We are all given a certain number of temperaments and certain levels in those temperaments. And with those building blocks, we can decide that we're going to construct with it or we're going to ignore it.
I feel like that brings back to your point earlier about balance, right? I think the current cutting edge research shows that genetic materials is about 40% and epigenetic is about 60%. And epigenetics is, of course, environmental feedback. It's your social environment, your zip code, history, trauma, etc. But I think it is important to realize that it's both. We live in the world of or, A or B, but it is both. But of course, that balance looks different for everyone. But I just wanted to bring that message back.
No, I'm glad you mentioned the epigenetics because I think about this. So I teach at one of the most diverse schools in the entire East Coast, George Mason University. And you're talking about racial diversity, religious diversity, countries of origin. And one of the things that I always think about is when I first start any semester is what is the baseline capacities that I can assess to some degree in these students? And I'm not interested in necessarily who's the best student. I want to know what percentage of change can I bring with each person in this class? Now, if you are at really high levels, your room for change with the ceiling effect is much smaller than someone that came from an opportunity poor environment and did not win the cortical lottery. They have bad genetics, to go to your example. So in terms of epigenetics, I think of myself as a facilitator and professor of I can create in one semester an opportunity-rich experience such that you get enough traction in your personal growth that the next when I don't have you in subsequent semesters and years, you can use this as a launching pad. And that's my perspective. And that's why I love teaching so much. That's why I love getting in front of a room full of people, is not to just hand down, the 10 commandments of psychological principles, like a Moses character, but more of like, hey, let me work with you and let's boggle around with your ideas and questions such that you're going to have an intense level of curiosity. You're going to feel that humility that you mentioned in terms of, wow, I do have a lot to learn from people that know a little bit more than me. I do like reading these articles because I can see how I'm understanding myself and the world better. And then the perspective getting, which is they can model. I'm really trying to understand how they see the world because whatever they offer me, I will offer metaphors or analogies that match their interests. You love sports? I'll go there. You love crochet? I'll go there. You love gardening? I'll go there. And to make sure that it's really diverse and it's fun because I never know what's going to come up next.
And that's your subtle strategy of, once again, moving through emotional resistance in group bias, right? You're speaking their language, which is one of your strategies you outline in the book. I do want to go into cognitive resistance really quickly. Can you define what it is and how it's different from emotional resistance? But more importantly, you talked about fostering change as a job of a professor. And I always talk about change only happens from within, right? People can foster it, encourage it, but the actual process of change happens from within. So what does that cognitive resistance look like, or dismantling it with your students?
So we really have to think about these cognitive biases that arose from Aaron Beck usually gets credit, one of the originators of cognitive therapy, but Albert Ellis actually started before him to really get at cognitive therapy. These are the originators. And it was just, if you think about why someone has such a stable, intractable, rigid position about their political views, you can see the biases. So first, there's a group bias, which is that I wouldn't be part of this group if they were weak or inferior. So right away, you define your group in extremely excessive positive terms. Then there's the confirmation bias, which is that I'm only looking for information that confirms the conclusion I already have, which is this is the way of seeing the world. And I can easily filter the sources of data that come through me that confirms that view. And it feels really valid because I've already decided I'm going to X out any information source that doesn't modify that view. And then you have the bias in terms of it's like a severity bias, which is that the more severe and strong that my views are, the belief is, why would I feel so strongly and have such conviction about this if it didn't have some validity to this? And these really come from, you could feel the lack of intellectual humility that undergirds some of these. Then you have the filtration bias, which is that you mentally filter out information that is uncomfortable, disarming, difficult to process, and you keep the information that's easy to entertain because it fits with the things that you value and fits with things that you care about. You start to combine a few of these things together and you realize that it becomes very easy to hold the line of what your position is and be basically resistance to any persuasive influences that come in the world. And you can view persuasion as a negative thing of someone trying to infiltrate your brain and make you think something you don't want to think. And really quickly, as you build up the psychological pieces, you start to understand why conspiracy theories exist, why people are intolerant, and why people have such negative views of outsiders.
That's a great list of some of the most, I guess, common cognitive biases that we have. And of course, there's a whole list more. But I would love for you to go into why you feel like change can happen from outside. Speaking of principled rebel, right? I love disagreements in the podcast.
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of productive conflict. And one of the reasons, so this is going to be up for interpretation. So one thing that I like to do is very somatic exercises. So for example, in one of my workshops, I think we were in Colombo, Sri Lanka. And there was a banker who said, one of the things is men just don't desire connection and intimacy like women do. And I know that this came up in some of your other podcast episodes. And I said, hold on, that is a testable hypothesis. So let's just do it right now. So right away, I asked people to stand 6 feet apart from each other. And this is in Sri Lanka. It's bankers from around the world, about 180 bankers from around the world. And I said, one of you is going to be the walker. One of you stand still. All I want you to do as the walker is very mindfully walk towards the other person. And when either one of you says stop, you stop exactly where you are and stay there. And just know that no means no. And so everyone's walking, everyone stopped. And I said, just look around the room and see how close or how far people, when they actually said stop, I'm not comfortable with you getting physically closer. And tell me what patterns you see. And so some people will say is that mixed sex dyads ended up being further away than same-sex dyads, right? And then some people would say, it looks like that the men, if it's a male-male that are together, they're much further apart than women and women in terms of them being together. And I said, how many people are actually physically touching? Because some people are hugging or shoulder to shoulder. And they get in there because they're just totally comfortable with physical contact in this room. And someone said, there's not one man in the entire room who's physically in contact with anyone. And then gets the interesting question. Why do you think you're seeing the patterns that you're seeing? And everyone starts revealing their biases that they have. And then I'll ask for permission of hey, is there any male in the room that would be uncomfortable me asking just a bunch of questions like a talk show host? And after talking to them, you ask them, why did you want to be this far away from the person that you're with? What were you worried about in terms of threats? And as you're talking, you're processing this out loud. You're seeing them change their view. I don't front load this and say, my goal is to change your view about how close you just stand next to a stranger. My goal is just to see you notice how your biases impinge even your physical movements through the world. But by having the questioning, very calm, curious questioning without threat, you could see people change their mind. So I would view this as just one example of how change occurs from behavioral experiments and not necessarily from within.
That's interesting because I think the underlying thesis of that is established safety, right? And I talk about that with that episode you alluded to, right? I think with men or women or whoever, because humans love pattern recognition. It's a fallacy, but patterns imply safety. Safety implies familiarity. And we like what we're familiar with. Like addictions, case in point. I work with well-diagnosed populations. And addiction is a brain disease, right? People still think it's a moral or willpower issue. It's not true. It's a brain disease. And a lot of people who are addicted, who are recovering addicts, they struggle to break their patterns because neurologically or otherwise or behaviorally, all they know is chaos and all they know is addiction, even though it's not healthy for them. So even if it's unsafe, it feels safe because it's familiar. And sounds like you were able to establish some sort of a safety. So these stranger bankers, they feel comfortable to be receptive towards this productive disagreement that you're posing.
Yeah. So actually, I love the way that you're framing this because you're saying is that maybe one of the parameters of where change occurs from without prior to within is you have to establish this sense of safety that occurs there. And I think I definitely would agree with that hypothesis.
Mm-hmm. So I do want to go off tangent and we'll come back to some of the fascinating concepts from your book, just because you're a professor. I have a lot of professor friends, right? And most of my guests are professors. That's where my brain lies. And there's a lot of increasing threat of academic censorship. And a lot of tenured professors are at risk or have lost their tenured professorship because of increased sensitivity, because of increased emotional and cognitive resistance, and lack of intellectual humility and the death of nuances. It is happening, it's permeating throughout society. Stand-up comedy is one, right? Academics too, and there's quite a few other industry that's impacted. How have you been navigating, because you talked about George Mason being one of the most diverse schools in the country or in the East Coast. Like A, have you noticed that? And B, what is your principled rebel strategies to move through this landscape or change of landscape in academics?
Yeah, I'm glad you're covering this, right? This Greg Lukianoff with this book, The Canceling of the American Mind, kind of really hits this home that you can't ignore the data. That's what I love. That's the most important thing that he did with that book as a civil rights attorney. It's there. Universities are the canaries in the coal mine. Everyone's experiencing now in the work. But my friends who are in the FBI and the CIA and the U.S. Marshals, they're seeing it there, where it's a little bit scary because you're talking about life and death scenarios. This is not a time to be worrying about offending someone with the language that you use. That might be because often the gallows humor is exactly what allows people to cope with the dealing with human trafficking or EMT workers that are dealing with, bodies that are on the street. It's not supposed to be public knowledge how they cope with it in terms of using very, crude terminology. So in the classroom, I've experienced all sorts of attempts of censoring me over the course of the years. One of the things is I have a very diverse view of diversity compared to what's normative at a university, which is I'm still a huge fan of meritocracy. I love the pipelines to be filled with entries to opportunity-rich and opportunity-poor environments. But there, at certain levels, there's so many applicants for so few slots, scarcity, that you have to have filters. And it doesn't help the students or the interns or the faculty members if they're too green and don't have the experience and you're setting them up for failure just because you're tokenizing them. You need them there to feel good because it fits with this value system and it makes you look good in terms of the brochure of your university. But if they're not ready and prepared for it, now all of a sudden you have more data potential to say is that here's a group of people that underperform. To me, there's no benefit other than a very superficial moral win. Now, on the specifics of it, I'm going to say this, which is where I differ a little bit with Greg Lukianoff and others, is because I'm on the front lines, I could say there are very few students that are really telling professors, telling other students, you can't say that, don't talk this way, this is out of lines. But maybe that's because of this, is that one of the things that I've adapted to in terms of a principled rebel strategy is for the past probably 7 years, I spend the entire first week of explaining what the culture of this classroom is going to be like and how productive conflict is a learning pedagogical strategy that I want to deploy, that will be deployed and will be common. And if you don't want to engage and learn how to have more productive conflicts as an underpinning of this class, maybe this isn't the right class for you. And so I start just from the basics. For example, assume positive intent until proven otherwise. This goes to your stand-up comedian comment, which is important, is the intent of a comedian is to make you laugh. And one of the most interesting, I think, sociological trends to see is the people that get upset by stand-up comedians are rarely the group that was targeted by the joke. And so when you think about like all of the criticisms against David Chappelle, and he, his last round of stand-up comedy was heavily focused on physically disabled and handicapped people. And many of them said, thank you for not excluding me as your targets because no one ever mentions it, as if we're invisible. We know you see the wheelchair. We know that you see the eye patch that makes me look like a pirate. And to let you know, I'm a pirate every year for Halloween because it's, I finally get to be me. And just like, and everyone thinks it's a costume that happens there. To assume that they're too weak automatically that they can't handle humor and they're there for humor, to me, is that just the tyranny of low expectations. Now, if they are upset, as I tell students in my class, if I upset you, not in front of the whole class, not with the audience there, come tell me. I will be hyper apologetic. And if you give me permission, the next class, I will apologize in front of the whole class. You won't get the results you want if you attack me in front of the entire class just to win that moment of likability and approval and righteous indignation. So think about your strategy. And so I teach them in terms of productive conflict. Don't do it to win crowd approval. Do it because you want me to change my behavior and you want every professor to change your behavior. And I think the mistake that often people make, it's not just young people. You go for the audience capture as opposed to, but do you really care about them changing? Because it seems like you just want a platform for yourself. That's not a long-term strategy to alter culture to be more inclusive and more accepting of diversity.
Yeah, that reminds me of the book How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie, one of the first-time books of its kind. And one of the principles that's been distilled, synthesized, and passed on in School of Management is praise in public, but criticize in private.
Yeah.
Every leadership needs to do that. I do that with my employees on the team as well. But it's interesting because you talked about if you have any issues, come with me privately on a one-on-one, right? Without the audience captive phenomena you alluded to. And it's really important because I just want to bring in another figure, Jordan B. Peterson, right? Of course, he's one of the well-known public figures. I personally believe he's one of the greatest intellectuals of our time. If you really look at his clinical acumen, his original thinking, he's one of the few thinkers think for himself. But through this process, you offend a lot of people. But speaking of trends, community, which is Dave Chappelle's a lot of backlashes in the past two specials, because I watched all of them. Jordan B. Peterson said, if any of my students and clients or patients come to me in private saying that these are my preferred pronouns, he said, I will 100% respect you and I will call you using your preferred pronouns, of course. But if you're trying to create a audience captive or the spectacle in public, or even on the political policy aspect to impose your will onto mine, then I'm not okay with it because of his principles, right? It's neither here or there, but I think it speaks to the nuances where not everything you see is truth, and we're all multidimensional and we're capable of defending our personal freedom and our personal principles while also agreeing with the people and giving them the respect. Last thing I would say is I had Leah Lamar. She's a pretty well-known comedian from LA. She's open for Bill Burr, Mark Manson, some of the biggest greats. And she said this beautifully. She said that, because we're talking about people outside of the container of show that's getting offended, even though the jokes are delivered towards the live audiences who love whatever comedians are sharing, because it's a double lens. It's very abstract. But she said that we all need to give other people the liberty to defend themselves and speak for themselves.
Yeah.
It's the basic dignity that we all deserve. So you can't get offended for someone else's behalf because you just hijacked their dignity and liberty, which is what you spoke about with the pirate eye and the people in a wheelchair.
I mean, it's such an important concept to me because as someone who's raising 3 daughters who are high school and middle school, I raised them to challenge authority themselves. And there was one time where one of my daughters challenged a music teacher. You could ask people to join this after school program, but don't pressure them. Mm-hmm. And so what she did was, quick story, is she brought all the kids outside of the class and said, hey, financially, I need more students in my class. So if those of you taken it before, this would be a good time to take it now. And my daughter, I wasn't there, raised her hand and said, I thought you weren't allowed to pressure us. And she got pissed. I got called. She went to the vice principal's office and I got called in and they told me the story. And I'm like, and I said, she probably phrased this terribly to the teacher. I don't know what the phrasing was. It wasn't what I just said right now. She's in 5th grade at the time. Now she's 17. Why would you expect a 5th grader to know how to be assertive in a situation where there is an authority figure doing something they think is wrong? She spoke up. Like, you should be praising her. That teacher should be praising her and say, I am so glad you spoke up. I just wish you did it this way. And then I would have listened even more. Scaffolding. right? Just like shaping, helping her like frame it better. And so what I told the vice principal was, so there was a missed opportunity from that teacher. I'm happy to have her and talk to her right now. But the second part of this is, and this gets to the point, and this gets to the comedian that you mentioned who talked about the liberty to defend yourself, is by you saying that my daughter's in trouble is saying she should have no voice. And so if she goes to high school and someone snaps her bra from behind and she says, don't do that, and they do it a second time, and she says one more time, and all bets are off, and he does it a second time, my daughter has permission to take a stapler and smash that kid over the head. They asked twice. Third time, in terms of anger, you've just now proven like you are not a fair member to have a conflict with in society, and you're refusing that my bodily autonomy matters. I said, you as the vice principal are preparing my daughter now to sit there quietly and let him keep on pulling and poking and pushing her. And I'm training her to do the opposite and stand up for herself. And they said, good point. And that was the end of, but it shouldn't require a psychologist to come in to explain these things. It should be part of the training, which is that if your kids who you're describing as behavior problems are communicating something they don't like and not doing it well, don't tell them not to do it. Help them, shape them to say, here's the difference between passive, aggressive, which is what we could describe your behavior. And let me show you like an assertive way of doing it. And let's switch roles. You sit where I sit. I'm going to go into the kid seat. I'm going to play the aggressive kid, the passive kid, and then show you the assertive kid.
I want to ask you a quick question. I would love for you to define metacognition, right? Of course, metacognition is just meta, in between. Cognition is thinking. So thinking about thinking. But I feel like you sort of underlines these two in what you just said is obedience is a double-edged sword, right? I always tell my mentees who are college students, as long as you're living under your parents' roof, you have no right. You can start speak up and defy your parents once you move out away from their financial support. But as long as you live under their roof, you do what they're told because they're paying for your roof, right? Same for high school, same for 16, 15, 14, whatever. So there is a certain level of normative role that obedience requires because society comprises of people, right? We're not just trying to defy for no reasons. But I think through unprocessed obedience, you lose your ability to critically think for yourself, like what your daughter did. Because I was the same way. I got into a lot of troubles. My mom got called by principal every other week. Right. And then, but she was like, well, these are normal boy behavior. What do you expect otherwise? Right. And there's no danger. He didn't harm anyone. Because I used to be very argumentative against teachers because I like to ask a lot of whys. That's why I started a podcast. But what I realized with teachers, at least high school teachers, their thresholds for whys is very limited. They're okay with the third whys, but if you keep asking, they think, oh, you're here to resist me. So even same for professional relationship, even with some of the colleagues. Is I'm asking one more why because I still don't understand what you're saying. The logic aspect's missing because for me to internalize what you're telling me, I need to first understand it. And that's but that's a very nuanced lens. But going back to it, why do you feel like it's a problem that metacognitions and our ability to critically think for ourselves is diminishing over time?
I'd love to hear one of these stories of young Benoit like being trying to crush a teacher with questions. This goes back to something you said earlier about like, did you use a third person perspective like Darwin when you were writing your books? Mm-hmm. The answer is yes. This is a lot of Ethan Cross's research on self-distancing. And really, you captured metacognition very simply, which is it is contemplating how our minds are actually working. And where it gets really interesting is like in the wild, in the feral world, like when you are all of a sudden upset and you find yourself raising your voice against a cashier because you're overcharged, the metacognition is, which you're not verbalizing hopefully out loud, which is, why am I getting upset over such small stakes affairs right here? Mm. And then that metacognition, which you as a therapist, you're trying to train people, which is that is the voice of conscious that's telling you basically is maybe there's a gap between how you would like to be and how you're actually behaving, or who you are and how you're actually behaving. And this is a good thing. And it might feel a self-critical, self-denigrating comment, but it shows that you have strong moral fibers inside you. And so, you are attacking yourself, but you noticing that is, okay, Why am I attacking myself? Because I am acting with disproportionate rage to the situation and the difficulty that I'm facing right here. And if you get good at this, you can, in the middle of something, in the middle of a problem, apologize. Like, you know what? Let me just do this over. I have had like a terrible day. I'm taking it out on you, and I apologize. I won't go into all the details, but mea culpa, so sorry. Let's just forget everything that I just said before. And again, my apology. And then you apologize to everyone online. And here's the thing. It's not a sign of weakness. It is such a sign of strength. And it's such a great modeling. I mean, one of the beauties of having kids is you realize like you're a role model all the time. And so it makes you hopefully a better person. It's a combination of like psychological awareness and then becoming a parent, and you combine the two together. And so I'm constantly being reminded of all the mistakes that I make. Benoit, like, don't you wish you were raised like just one generation before, raised in a way where that my parents and grandparents would expose when they were wrong ever? And I mean, I can't think of one example off the top of my head of them ever saying that they were wrong in the way that they communicated to me over my young formative years.
I mean, not even young. I'm still going through my relationship rupture with my dad, and we haven't spoken in like 2 years because of a lot of underlying situations, and it's his fault. I mean, I have some ownership, but it's largely his mistake. All of his family agree. He still doesn't apologize. He is 71. I've never heard him say sorry. Not once. They do like these sideline things to sort of like appease you, and you can sort of feel their sentiment of apologies, but they've never verbalized it. Because I think in speaking of therapy, right, what I learned is we often don't know what is true until we've spoken into existence. That's why therapy or reading, they're just different vehicles for growth. It's the same thing. You need something, a sort of a speed bump, to forcibly snap you out of your psychological landscape to see, oh, like you said, what's the gap? Someone honked me out of nowhere. Why am I so angry and have this burning rage to chase him down, waste 2 hours of my time and try to like brake check him? That's not me. I don't have road rage because of all the horror stories, but I've seen those incidences a lot, especially in LA. But I want to go into what you just mentioned, right? One of the, I think, most important concepts in your book, Todd, is psychological realness. And your response sort of hints at that, right? So what is it? And why is it even more relevant today than before?
Like, you can ask this question to yourself. What social hierarchies am I in that is having a big influence over me? There's a regular analogy that we often make, which is life is constantly like being in a middle school cafeteria, where you come in with your tray and you're wondering which table to sit at. And there's a table that you would love to be invited to that you never get invited to. There's a table you could easily sit down. They would be like so psyched if you would sit down with those characters. And there's a table that you're part of. It could be a sense of safety, like we talked about earlier, which is something that you've kind of tantalizingly worked the edges of. Inertia, which is you spend time with those people, but they're not really your people. They're just people that have accepted you. But you know that this isn't really your home and your place. And that's where it gets really interesting in terms of change, because there's such a pull not to do anything. So psychological realness is a concept I didn't come up with, which is not when something happens, but as soon as we feel that it is inevitable that something's going to occur, it starts to influence us before the event. And one of my favorite studies about this was Brown v. Board of Education. You know, right before the legislation was that it was now illegal to have education standards that were different for Black and white students. It was mostly focused on Black and white students, if you look at the legislation, but it's really all the races. And before legislation comes into place, there is a several months, if not years, where you know it's coming down the pipeline. Now, one of the interesting side effects, getting back to trade-offs about this, is that when it was clear that Brown was going to win this case, and the time has come for, in the midst of the Jim Crow laws, that, you know, society is changing, at least at the legal level. No more segregated schools in terms of being legal. Those historically Black colleges and historically Black schools actually viewed segregation as more desirable, not less desirable, once they believed that the law was going to be passed. And this is kind of interesting. There's lots of ways of interpreting it, but one way of interpreting it is in terms of something that we've been talking about, is this stable self-concept. Like you understand yourself as being Black is the primary feature of your identity. You're at a historically Black college. You're at a Black grade school that you're a part of. It's built into the fiber of the place you spend more hours of the day than anything else in a given week. And so the idea that that's going to be taken from you, even though it is a societal improvement, you have this defensive response. As soon as it becomes psychologically real, that I'm going to dig my heels in and actually fight for, I don't want to be in the same place where everyone else is. I feel comfortable and safe in the environment I'm in. And this is something that's really important to think about as we think about presidential elections, the furor about the state legal and illegal abortion debate that's kind of occurring around the country. Just thinking about like how we think about, diversity being mandated or not mandated in a school or in a workplace. Like, what does that mean to be mandated? And what is the exact strategy that's been using? As soon as you know it's going to be psychologically real, this is going to be added. You're going to have people that are defensive think, I'm now going to get less. It's a zero-sum game just because of this thing that's around the corner. What will you do to prevent them from destroying your institution or your organization or your group from the inside before it becomes psychologically real? And I don't think enough people are thinking about this. And so you have friction, which is the very first thing that you asked me about. But now you have unnecessary friction that you could have managed in advance, but you didn't consider this psychological piece.
I think that brings in the common saying nowadays that perspective is reality. It's not true. Perspective is perspective. Reality is reality. Because our perspectives are often distorted or twisted based on your own emotionality, what you've gone through. Because what's in the internal always projects externally. That is the case. I do want to bring in a situation that's happening now. MIT, they're under the fire with Congress and hearings and things because they created a segregated dorm for Black students. I might be getting this wrong. I think they call it chocolate love or something like crazy, right? It's only for Black. Yeah, it's happening as we speak. It's only for Black students in MIT. The dorms, it's segregated. And one of the congressmen was asking them, so you're trying to go back to segregation? And then the school administrators were saying, no, we just want to provide a safe and comfortable setting for Black students. But that begs the question, right? A, did the Black students ask for it? And B, you're assuming and you're taking away their liberty and dignity, as we talked about the comedian Leah Lamar. You're taking away their liberty and dignity to sit with discomfort, if any. There might not even be any discomfort for these Black students, but these are imposed upon them at one of the most prestigious schools at MIT. So I just want to bring this in because this is very, very relevant, especially in 2024 with the primary season.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of angles to play with here. I mean, one is, which environments do you want to bring as a precedent, this kind of microenvironment in there, right? The microenvironment is the idea of like, we're going to have racially segregated housing. And then what are the parameters? Like, where does it stop? If a bunch of white students from the South, where it's their Southern heritage, and they have these accents that don't fit in Massachusetts when they come in there, if they do it, once you set the precedent, this is the psychological realness. The psychological realness is you have now granted license to that anyone that feels unsafe, and the reason for feeling unsafe is something at the social level. So the groups that you're a part of or the groups that you aspire to part of, you're setting up a terrible precedent for splicing up the diversity of the school such that it is diverse as a whole, but incredibly homogenous in terms of the individual groups that exist in that university or that space. And the other part of this, which is to me more important as an educator, is what's the purpose of higher education? And so outside of the school, you can choose anyone you want to live with. I mean, you could live with an entire building of Satanists. I mean, it doesn't matter. Like true Satanists, like, it doesn't matter. But in these hollowed hallways and grounds is one of the goals for you to learn how to interact with people where you might feel not necessarily unsafe, but ambiguity in terms of where you fit in with them. Because once you graduate in the real world, you have no idea who's going to be hired after you. You have no idea who you haven't been exposed to when you accept that job position that occurs there. You're probably going to be interacting, if it's a decent sized country, with people from other countries where my guess is you do not know a deep enough details to talk about what separates different African countries in terms of the cultural bearings of having an identity that's tied with the self versus tied with the groups. Like, you probably don't know this stuff. So you might feel very uncomfortable and very unsafe and very unsure. And I always think of my job with young people is to prepare you for a world full of uncertainty, novelty, complexity. And when we speak of diversity, people whose views you have never heard of before. So forget like the mentions of Marxism and communism and conservatism. Have you ever met someone that identifies as Rastafarian? Have you ever identified with someone who truly is like Buddhist or Orthodox Jew? And the odds are for most of us is no, because my world's never touched theirs.
Yeah, echo chamber is more growing, right? The vortex of in-group bias and confirmation bias. I want to go back to your book and I want to bring this in, tying everything we just talked about, external versus internal. I feel like, I could be wrong, Todd, but I feel like you dedicate the front half of your book talking about the underlying thesis of external locus of control versus internal locus of control. What is the concept of external locus of control and why is that a must know for everyone?
It's an old concept of psychology, but newer doesn't necessarily mean better, which is that the degree to which you sense that you have agency and you are empowered to take action is something that is outside the self. And all of us face this. And I love what you said before, and I couldn't nod my head enough times, which is there is an objective reality and there are tons of perceptions that you could have about reality. And this is very problematic for people to be thinking of. There are multiple realities. So when it comes to things outside of your control, there's going to be a new president of the United States, whether it's the same president for 4 different years and you act differently the second time around, or it's going to be a new president, an actual new person that's going to pop in there. This is external locus of control. We, as individuals, don't get to control this. So the decision and psychological fortitude that we have determines of what can we control and what are we going to do about it. And one of the things that's really useful in these situations is to go back to pattern recognition of what has happened with prior presidencies in terms of someone that is unlikable, relatively problematic personality, behavior style. We haven't had presidents this old before, so that's something new. So you have big, huge generational divides, but it gets to that there's going to be perceptual differences of how you see the world, more so than probably prior presidencies. But you have people like Andrew Jackson that were in president. This was the guy who was probably on the 5th percentile of agreeableness. So not kind, not polite, not compassionate, totally disagreeable, love going to duels, love fighting with people, physically fighting people. Someone like that today as president, they would be crushed on a daily basis on social media, just getting into physical altercations with people. That was Andrew Jackson. If you go back through history, there's plenty of precedents to show like disagreeable characters go in, people that you don't like. And yet the nation, because it's so heterogeneous, that is the internal locus of control, is getting a sense of knowledge, skill, ability, and coping skills by looking to the past, simulating the future, and thinking about your more proximal environments. How does this really affect my physical health, my relationships, my workplace, where I go to the gym, where I play pickleball, where I take my kids for meals? And the answer for a lot of domains is this has zero influence whatsoever. And I think we forget about this. And someone listening to this will probably write in the comments, which is that's because you have a sufficient life as a middle-aged white guy where it doesn't affect you. I'm saying for everyone, there are a multitude of life domains and parts of your multidimensional personality that are going to be totally unaffected, even if you despise what the next 4 years will bring in governments. And that's internal locus of control.
That's like the severity bias you brought it earlier, right? Because I'm concerned by this, therefore it must be valid, therefore it must the magnitude of it, therefore I must defend it, by being a keyboard warriors or not. But I want to segue into another concept that really I didn't know about this. What is John Henryism and why is this a little known yet important concept?
So this is an old American fable that's been brought into the world of medicine and health. The story of John Henry is, here is this incredibly strong Black man in the 1800s who is upset because all this technology is coming, that it's going basically, it's like AI today, where it's going to steal the jobs on the railroad of all these blue collar workers. And he says, I can beat any machine in terms of drilling into the ground. And so he has this massive hammer and he's going against this drill and he beats the drill, but then he drops dead of a heart attack from the sheer exertion of trying to fight against this and win this battle. So win the battle, lose the war. And what the research shows of John Henryism, for those people that have studied it, is that this is a personality trait of excessive conscientiousness, hard work, and diligence that leads to high levels of performance but high levels of burnout. And the way that this burnout often gets measured is in terms of hypertension and, other kind of like physiological indicators of being overworked. And this was mostly studied in the 1980s. Just because it hasn't been popular lately, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Is that particularly for Black men who are in the workplace, you would see a high rate of John Henryism, where excessively hardworking, extreme physiological demands that was more than actually their body could handle. And you would see high levels of physical stress, low levels of mental well-being and emotional well-being, and not interfering with performance at work, but interfering with being able to get to work. So more injuries, more illnesses, more absences, and more, I love this term, presenteeism, is that you're there at work, but you actually kind of zone out and you're actually not doing anything when you're there. And it's one of these like silent killers, because until you give a name for it. And once you give a name for it, you realize, oh, this isn't just for African-American men. This is actually a lot of women in the workplace. I mean, one of the really cool organizational psychology findings is if there's less than 2 members of a very visible minority group in an organization, those individuals experience this experience of John Henryism more likely, where high physiological toll, high performance, but you're dying from the inside in terms of illnesses and injuries.
Quick story. My wife, Becky, she's a physician, and she, of course, you have people who respect your workforce, career aside, and she has a few mentors and she calls them badass physicians. She's like, they're so badass, they're awesome. So she told one of her mentors that, hey, you're such a badass doctor. I respect you. I want to be like you. And she told Becky, she's like, actually, only women doctors are called badass doctors because it assumes that women perform less than men. Because if you see a male doctor excelling at their job, you just call them, oh, they're being good doctors. But when women excel in the workforce of a physicians or otherwise, you call them badass. It's like the wheelchair example. You assume their baseline of competence is lower. So actually calling them badass, it is a compliment. Of course, Becky meant well, and she does mean well. But the underlying tone is, oh, I'm a badass because you didn't expect me to be. So I think that's interesting.
I think about LinkedIn of how much support there is for women in work. And that's worth contemplating, is the degree to which there's othering. And it's almost like self-othering, where we're this separate species. So let's devote a lot of time to kind of honoring and putting us on a pedestal. And in that way, you're never fully integrated into the machinery of workplaces or whatever environment you're in, because we keep on highlighting this one feature. You have 367 dimensions of who you are.
Mm-hmm. And same for biracial folks, right? Anyone that's biracial, half black, half white, half black, half Asian, doesn't matter. Americans really struggle to honor biracial identity because they forcibly put them into, oh, so you're black. It's like, no, I'm 50% black. Oh, so you're black. No, I'm 50% black, right? A lot of my biracial friends of mine, they struggle with that because they feel like society doesn't accept them for both, because we love putting things to boxes, because once again, patterns. And if something we're comfortable with, it must be safe. So let's go with that. Even though labeling culture, putting anything into a box diminishes their essence and kills other identities that they have.
Wait, I'm so curious. So if I was to ask your friends, like, how would they like people to respond or society to respond in an ideal way? What would they say?
Half. They're mixed.
Oh, like how would they want the world to work with those dual identities?
I think they just, because especially with like a lot of, this is a general statement, but from my understanding, a lot of Black communities, they have a lot of ownership because Blacks are highly prosecuted upon, historically speaking. So a lot of my biracial friends, half Black, half white, in this example, they feel forced to hyper honor and hyper highlight their Black identities. So when they say, oh, so you're just Black then, they feel siloed and they feel uncomfortable fighting than saying, no, I'm actually also half white.
Right. Like the idea of if there's whatever the story of the month is, that they're supposed to speak up on it because, and they might have a more of just a different view because they're different.
Yeah. It's like the culture piece too. But what you said earlier, Todd, reminds me of another concept I learned maybe a couple months ago, productivity dysmorphia.
Do tell.
Yeah. So it's like high achievers, like some of us, we always feel like we're not being productive enough because as you systemize your life, you are getting more efficient at doing this. You're increasing your output based on the same input. So as you're systemizing your life, you create more free time and free space in your time, in your life. That's what the point of systemizing is. But because you systemize it, you have more free time. So you feel like you're not doing enough because your baseline changed. So it's like feeling dysmorphic about your productivity. It's never enough. And I think that ties into John Henryism as well.
Yeah, I like that you stole the language from body dysmorphia because it feels very nicely, right? So I was just talking about this in one of my classes where there's so much attention to eating disorders, particularly like in female athletes, but so little attention to boys and men that experience this body dysmorphia of wanting these bodybuilding bodies where they feel strong and have this, sense of confidence walking through the world. Actually, that really hits with me because you are really trained, social normalized to believe that if there's extra time before 5 o'clock, this is to be spent, not frittered away on leisure, but to be spent on work. And I definitely experience exactly what you're describing. And I do really believe in Nietzsche's concept of consciousness is expanded by new language categories. So it's not the labeling and categorizing of people or ourselves. It's more of that you just gave me a term to describe an experience that was a little bit too fluid. So it kind of dripped through my fingers versus now I can hold on to say, hey, how am I going to work this for you?
Yeah, there is a well-known modality in the therapy space called neuro-linguistic programming, NLP, but that's what neuro-linguistic is, right? Like I said, you don't know what's real until you spoke it into existence. Yeah, I think productivity dysmorphia is very relevant because we put productivity on a pedestal, all these overachievers, all these great shining squirrels in the podcasting realm, right? You look up to them, but like Pat Flynn, Joe Rogan, a lot of these people look up to, they forget they're not married, they don't have kids. Right. And so people forget that there's a trade-off going all the way back to the beginning of the conversation. But like, it's kind of crazy. Like, what's the point of freeing up your time by being systematic if after systemization, you put more stuff onto it? So it's like a hamster wheel, but it's entirely self-inflicted.
So this is what resonates with me. And it fits with a principled rebel strategy, which is processing fluency helps you clear a message towards the majority that they aren't ready to hear yet. Really simplistic messages that are easy to understand. What are the benefits if this worked exactly as planned? And then what's going to be the pain point for me by changing based on what you said? And if people are really clear with this, you're going to make more inroads. And so one of the reasons along those same lines about processing fluency being very persuasive, as someone who studies meaning and purpose in life, I can never get any traction for people being interested in this topic because there's no emoji. There's a happy face for happiness. You're like, all right, that's not happiness, but you now know what I mean. What would you possibly put for a sense of purpose in life that's strong and powerful and potent that goes in there? It doesn't have the same kind of ease with which you can describe these things. And so the way that you do this is you go Darwin and you start describing iconic characters and then basically reverse engineer them. So if you just, if you start describing what makes a Messi or what makes a Nelson Mandela, and you start kind of reverse engineering of like how their lives are constructed, it becomes really easy to understand like what a purpose in life is. Like when you say, are you willing to go to prison? Are you willing to die for your cause? That's one thing. But when you go through the details of the number of years that Nelson Mandela was in prison and what he did during those years, then it starts to bring it to life. And a lot of people are like, you know what? I don't know if I'd want to be in prison that long for like fighting for, racial injustice. And so you don't have to be Nelson Mandela, but think of it as a dimension. And let's just think about like, okay, what are you willing to sacrifice? And what do you want other people to sacrifice? One of the interesting things in the university, for example, is when you have this conversation about, for example, it comes up often, which is we need to have more Black men as professors in the department. Now, that's a very specific thing to say, And it's also very easy to kind of measure and work towards. Then there comes a very interesting question that pops up. Who's willing to give up their slot, or who's willing to take a pay cut to open a slot to allow this person in? And once you start having these very clear asks in terms of sacrifice, people get very quiet very quickly. Very easy to make the ask in terms of, I'm just assuming we'll get more resources. But when it comes to a finite amount of resources, goes back to, a really nice systematized approach to your productivity. And if you assume if the system is in place, now what are you going to do? And there's no sacrifices. I think differently about the cause. Now the question is, why do you want us to reprioritize when you don't really want to prioritize anything differently than you have before? You just want more.
Yeah, I'm about to release my next episode with Andrew Bustamante. He's a former CIA spy. He's been on everywhere. You might have seen his luscious hair. He says that people have this false belief that you want truth seeking. He said that's not true. People want comfortable truth that conforms to their comfortability. Because true truth seeking, like Nelson Mandela, it comes with a lot of sacrifices. Gandhi, prolific civil rights, right? Obviously, he changed the landscape, but he was a shitty, horrible father. Yeah. Horrible, negligent father.
So funny. I always talk about that.
Yeah. But so people are like, oh, I want to be like Gandhi. Are you willing to sacrifice your family? Right?
Yeah.
Because for him, that's the cause he was willing to do, and people respect him for that. But once it's a balance, people don't see what they see, and absolute truth doesn't exist. But even like the practical truth or whatever other layers of truth, people don't really know what they actually want. People think they do, but once you unpack it, like what you do, you're very good at deconstructing. People are like, oh, whoa, yeah, I don't want to spend 30 years in prison like Nelson Mandela did. Maybe 5 years, right?
So when I was in high school, my high school was across the street from the Nassau County prison. And so we had a field trip that was there in, I think, 10th grade. This was back when scared straight was a concept to prevent you from being a delinquent. And when you did a tour, they basically told the inmates to be rude and obnoxious to us, which I think was a great idea. And it really was scary to be in there. You think of like one day, like what would you do to survive? Now imagine yourself there for 24 hours. This is the amount of hours you're going to be in your cell. This is the hours you're going to be in the common space. This is when you're going to be in the yard when the guards aren't paying attention as people are socializing, working out, and all the gangs start to form together as they start to plot and talk to each other. Happens there. What are you going to do that 24 hours? And when you start to really think about, could you cope with 24 hours? You realize, okay, I'm taking this option off the table of doing anything that could lead me to being in prison, because I can't even imagine that. When you start getting into the details, then you start to realizing what's your potential, what are the barriers and obstacles, and what are the choices that you want to take off the table right off the way, and actually reduce the number of decisions and options. And clarify what is going to be your mission with your day, your week, this year, upcoming years.
This is an end note, because I can't believe you brought up Scare Straight, because that crossed my mind as you're talking about the jail experience. I'll encourage you to look up the data to actually prove that Scare Straight didn't work.
Oh, I know.
Oh, you did? Yeah. So,
well, the interesting thing, sorry for interrupting, is I always think of an intervention doesn't work. What can we learn from this small subset of people where it did work? And then is there any pattern in that group? And I think there's a lot of scientists that don't like it because it's post hoc analyzing of like, it's not what you planned for, but why would you not take advantage of the data? So if you go further and ask that question, you got all that data. What was the DARE program? I forget what the acronym is for, but that was basically to prevent kids from using drugs. That program didn't work either. But I don't remember anyone analyzing, okay, is there a subgroup of people where it worked particularly well for? And I just untouched data.
I really feel like data is there to inform our decisions, right? But once again, that requires intellectual humility, curiosity, going all the way back. So I want to talk about, and as you know, my podcast is very big on relationships and sexuality and meaningful relationships. And your chapter 5 highlights the psychology of alliance and friendship. Speaking of people, right? And how that's encoded into our DNA. We don't have to talk about your research here, but like, why is the rise of superficial friendships and relationships and the loneliness epidemic a huge concern, especially for men, principled rebels or otherwise?
there's a lot of variables to explain the high levels of loneliness, low number of people who say they have a confidant or one close friend that are happening, and the inability to form these meaningful factions of people where you can feel a sense of trust, a sense of care, and leveraging each other's strengths and compensating for each other's weaknesses. I mean, that's what you're looking for if you are lacking power and status and trying to make impact, or if you're just a group that just wants to perform at an optimal level that you're greater than the sum of its parts. I mean, one of the things that you want to look for is, to what degree do you find that you have people that are proximal to you or near you, that their near presence makes you feel energized and makes you feel motivated to pursue your goals. And a lot of us don't think about individuals in the context of our goals and the things we aspire to do in our lives. And I strongly encourage people to think about this. So not that we're using other people as a resource, but more of, it's a reciprocal relationship. One of the ways of thinking about relationships is, I grant you access to my house and the food and the drink. And if you need a place to stay, you can stay there. And you grant me access to your house, and we're going to respect each other's homes. We are going to knock on the door and show some respect in terms of entry. And we're going to show hospitality in terms of, I'm going to pay attention to you and to see whether there's something that you need that you might not be asking for. And if you think about relationships as opposed to a bank account, think about it as these two households and the hospitality and the sharing piece that comes in there. One of the hard things for men, more so than women, is the idea of asking for, I could use a place to rest. I could use some food from your house, and I could use some drink. And I just need some space for someone just to listen to me. And those asks are much more common for women compared to men. Now, there's some good research out there at Cornell showing that one of the problems that leads to this lack of companionship, lack of confidence, and this high level of loneliness is, we believe that asking someone for a favor is more of a burden than it actually is. So we have this asymmetry that it's too much for me to ask anything of you, and you'll view it negatively and you'll view me negatively. And when you actually deconstruct this from scientific studies, you find that people actually enjoy being asked for favors, because you're basically saying, I'm a wise counsel. Like, I'm useful for you. I'm valuable to you. You just gave me a sense of meaning and purpose at a small level in my life. And people really like that and enjoy that, but we think that they don't. And there's this other body of work at University of Chicago, which shows that when you're around strangers, there's this asymmetry in terms of the degree to which you're interfering with their space. And we think that other people don't want to be disturbed. They're on their smartphone, they're reading their magazine. I don't want to bother you. And so we think it will be more enjoyable for other people and more enjoyable for us not to make contact. When in fact, when people are asked, people would say, I would love for some interesting person to come up to me and start talking to me. And we think that it would be a cumbersome interaction, when in reality, people enjoy themselves much more than they anticipate that it's going to be. And when you start putting these asymmetries together, you realize you have a bunch of people running around seeking intimacy and connection, passing right by each other, because everybody assumes the state of not communicating is a favor to those people, as opposed to you're actually preventing them from getting their needs satisfied.
Concrete studies and statistics to drive your message home is, they did a 10-year longitudinal study with men and women, or husbands and wives or spouses. And it was a heterosexual studies. And about 86% of men or husbands said their best friends were their wives. Only 58% of wives said their best friends were husband.
Interesting.
That's a 25% difference. And that means men have less trusted confidants. And 86% resort to their wives as their best friends. But only 58% of women says, my husband's my best friend, but I got 3 others. And this is why men die earlier. Like, that's a fact. Sure, we have higher risk behaviors and things like that, right? But it really speaks to loneliness. And right now, study shows that the highest suicide rate is middle-aged 58-year-olds white men, right? Because they're really, really lonely. And obviously, superficial relationships, it even deepens, and you really feel this as you get older, although there are differences between aloneness and loneliness. But I just want to share that statistics because it blew my mind when I read that, but it does make sense.
Yeah, I mean, it fits nicely with Eli Finkel's work, which is the idea of one side, you can say, at least there's a best friend. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people say that their aspirational idea of a romantic relationship is it would be my lover and my best friend. But Eli Finkel's work actually kind of challenges that notion of saying we're asking too much and too many roles of a romantic partner, so that you're going to be my cheerleader, my advocate. You're going to soothe me when I have difficulties. You're going to be excited for me when I have my wins. You're going to be my bartender. You're going to be my therapist. And you add all these things together, and you have men more inclined to view their romantic partner as their best friend, but also blow it up because you're asking so much. It's so pressurized that it's hard to breathe with that little amount of oxygen left. How many roles can a person handle at the aftermath of a workday when you just want to chill, and however it is that you define chilling or engaging leisure in the aftermath?
And I think the real insidious danger in that is it raises expectations, which creates more space and opportunities for disappointments, which brews resentment, anger. I think there is more homicide or death by envy within relationships than car accidents every year. That's a lot.
It fits with a lot of work of when you think of what are the things that maintain a romantic relationship. One of them is you devalue the alternatives that are available. Mm-hmm. So this is where dating apps do the opposite, because all it does is highlight all the alternatives that are available at a fingertip. And so if it feels pressurized and there's no oxygen because you feel like you have to commit to so many forms of support with your romantic partner, and you see the ease of just having a conversation with someone at the stool next to you when you're sitting there having lunch, you're like, this is a valuable alternative. It just feels so light and relaxed. Of course, because you don't have the strains and you're not sharing lives and you remove all the stressors, everything seems easy in comparison. But this is where the slight differences that are available by here's an alternative, I'm able to make an expectation comparison. I view this relationship as being heavy and feel like it's like a burdensome to me. And this one feels light and airy in comparison. That psychological variable increases the propensity of having an infidelity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think people forget, once again, the equilibrium we started the conversation with. I think it's even true friendships or relationships. You need the pain. You need the shared suffering to really drive home the beauty of the relationship. Because I think stark contrast reveals the beauty, if you really think about it. But we're definitely coming towards the end of the conversation, Todd. And I do want to share a few heavy hitter questions. I saved until the very end, right? For yourself, but also for the listeners. Your second half of the book, especially towards the end, you highlight the importance of self-awareness. Everything we talked about today alludes to self-awareness. Because if you don't know yourself, how can you possibly understand other people? Because all relationships are extensions and reflections of your relationship with yourself, period. There's a quote, right? Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Why does power corrupt self-awareness? And I know this is a loaded question, so feel free to take this where you see fit.
Really, power does have a duality where it could lead to empowerment, where all of a sudden you grant people agency because you are in an enlightened position, because you have status and resources, and you kind of share those to some degree with people that are working with you or beside you. The corruption part comes from, and to some degree, you have people that want people to experience the level of difficulty and the level of hurdles and setbacks that they had to get to their vaulted position as them. This is an unfortunate, egotistical position of power, where I was going to say, Clarence Thomas is actually a good real world example of this, in terms of here was a guy who came from a very opportunity poor environment, was not expected to graduate high school, much less college, then becomes a Supreme Court justice. And could be possibly the biggest detractor of any diversity initiative to help someone who's from an opportunity poor environment. And so he's a perfect example of the research on power, which is that you want someone to experience the same level of difficulty that you experience in order for them to be at your position or near your position and climb up whatever it is, the levels of the game in the domain that you're in. And the problem with this is that the environment changes over the course of time for when you were younger and you were pursuing this. This is one of the problems when the generations compare, younger people of newer generations. You have boomers and Gen Xers that have problems with millennials and Gen Zers, is because they forget of just the hormonal challenge of being an adolescent, by itself, irrespective of what decade you were born in. Your natural, as you described it well, is you have almost no rights inside your household. So your need for autonomy is basically completely unsatisfied. Your need for competence is minimal because you don't get that many opportunities. People say, well, you can't get a job here and apply until you're 18 years of age, until you have a college degree, until you have 5 years of experience. So that need goes unsatisfied. And the third need that's left of the fundamental needs, the need for belonging, is often satisfied with people at the same age level. And the result of this, you don't gain wisdom by interacting with people that are 2 steps ahead of you. And you get to kind of figure out, like, what would you do differently if you were me? What did you do so that I can get from where I am to where you are? You're hanging out with people of the same age cohort. And so there's a trading of information, but not necessarily a trade of wisdom that happens there. And so power corrupts because we have lost our contact with people that are at stages of the game that we were in before we got there. And we end up becoming often exactly what we despised and what we overthrew in the first place.
Yeah, that chapter was one of my favorite books because you talked about the principal rebels who succeed. Oftentimes than not, they become the new system, the status quo. And you urge the readers and the people to really resist that change, which requires self-awareness and not forgetting the origins and where you came from. The opportunity poor with Clarence Thompson example. But I think that chapter is super important because politically or sociopolitically, that's what we might face, right? Because everything oscillates in society. And this is a thing I'm still fleshing out, but I always were confused about why do we always go from very left to very right, very left to very right. But if you think about systems, I actually do think course correction is needed. I think we do need to course correct because everything tends to overly course correct. Just like 10 years ago, nobody talked about mental health. Now everything talks about trauma. Everything's about mental health. But then there's a lot of things missing. And we have to be in the middle, feel the feelings, and also accept your ownership and not playing the victim card, right? So it's both. Like we are the victims to larger circumstances because life is larger than we are. And we need to take ownership of our responsibilities.
Yeah, it's even the language that's so important there because, I mean, I worked at the National Crime Victim Center in South Carolina working with sexual assault survivors. And back then, you would call someone a rape victim. And this is only in 2004. And now that terminology is already antiquated in a good way. Now you would say it was a sexual assault survivor. And in that way, you're not defining someone as a victim. You're not defining someone who's had someone engage in power over. You're defining someone as an adverse event happened, and there's a wide variety of things that can happen in the aftermath. And I completely agree with you. I think the idea of victimhood narcissism is a very unfortunate sociological trend. But like you said, it's a natural course correction from never discussing traumas publicly or even like in your family units beforehand.
We are multidimensional, and I think that's one of the theses of today's conversations in your book. Right? We need to work harder to expand our capacity to uphold many things about different people, even if they're seemingly in conflict, which is dissonance, right? But some of the people I respect the most are people who are comfortable swimming in the dissonance, because that's intellectual humility. We don't know what we don't know, and that's what science is, capital S. It is until it is not. And I think we need to be more humble.
Yeah, you had, and I don't know what it is. I just know that you alluded to it, which I love that, is that you just said like you had sexual trauma in your childhood and I do as well. And interestingly, I had this grad school interview when I was applying for PhD programs. And I had this professor that asked me all these, we'll just call them inappropriate questions, but they were probing questions and asked me, what's my relationship with my mom? Have I ever been to jail before? What's the most illegal thing that I've done? Things you could never ask now. And it's only in like 20 years. And then we ended up talking about, this traumatic background of mine. And his response was, you should have been in jail. Now, he actually passed away. He's a very distinguished researcher and was, and really defined this as a core piece of my narrative of, you should not be here right now. Like you shouldn't have succeeded to get this far when you're applying for a PhD program. And I walked away then and have the same view now, which was like, he was crafting a narrative for me that did not fit my own personal narrative, which is for me, these events are like on pages 11 and 12 of a 1,300 page book. And for him, it's the subtitle right on the cover, which is "Here Lies Todd Kashdan, like a trauma survivor." That goes in there. And I think this is one of the mistakes that we make. And so I want to make that visceral, like that kind of like a metaphor is you don't want to be writing the book of your life where it says, here is Stacy, a bulimic journey. You had bulimia. You might have recovered. It might have recurred again to happen there, but you're not defined by that. It's not your identity. I would encourage people to reduce the stigma, that you can talk about it as much as little as you want to, but think about whether that should be at the core or even the peripheral of your identity versus it's just one of thousands of things that have occurred during your lifetime.
Yeah. No, thanks for the disclosure. And mine happened freshman year in college, so not quite childhood, but I was able to heal through that through psilocybin therapy 6 years afterwards. So I saved what I think is the most intimate and personal question to close this out, right? Because we don't want to give away all the sauces from your book, so to be determined, right? But the book is honestly, it's a great book. I enjoyed it a lot.
Thank you.
You are walk the walk, talk the talk is very big. And you talk about different strategies. You use a lot of the third person Charles Darwin perspective throughout the book. But I want to go personal with you, Todd, to close out today's conversation. What are some of your principled insubordination stance and beliefs that you haven't shared publicly or with your work?
Oh, interesting. I mean, to be honest, I'm really public about my views. I really believe strongly in the world needs heterodox thinkers. I mean, for example, like I've shared my views on sex stratified sports, where I'm a huge fan of actually having it almost to the level of genotype versus, but definitely thinking very carefully before in terms of the hormonal influence that can have on a person, being very careful about who enters into, women's sports versus male sports. I've been very open about that. I think what I haven't shared is publicly, even though I've written about this, is that I don't think anyone can generate a sense of purpose in life as it's psychologically defined. And as we actually think about this, I think there actually are constraints. And there are some people, it could be because of a traumatic brain injury. It could be lead poisoning, like what happens like perinatal. It could be a genetic disorder where you have a compromised intellectual capacity. And it is difficult to create these higher order things of a superordinate goal system where you have a larger mission, sub goals, and then even smaller goals and tasks to work towards those goals to make inroads towards a purpose. And your purpose might be, protecting the unborn. Your purpose might be reducing the amount of objectification of women in society. And there's some people that could support the cause, but constructing your whole life around this requires very intense, higher level cognitive functioning. And I know it's not politically correct to say it, but I think there is somewhere a level, a barrier. I don't know what it is, what the number is. I don't think there's an exact number where some people do not have those cognitive capacities.
Well, first of all, I appreciate you sharing that, right? Once again, there's context, and I don't think people have a right to criticize someone without the proper context, right? Just like if you want to criticize a theory or a modality, therapeutically or psychologically, you first must commend and master the materials. That's when productive disagreement, as you talked about, can happen. Just so you're not alone, I'll share mine. I'll share my unpopular beliefs just to make you feel better on the podcast. And if you get any heat, I'll take them all. So it's the exact same thing. Like my first exposure to Pareto principle, Pareto law 80-20, which is ubiquitous across different animal kingdoms, real estate, social stratifications, and so on. And I think this is where university-based income has some validity. I think it can be flushed out and implemented better, since passing of a policy is not the same thing as implementation of a policy, because I'm a former policymaker. I do feel like the biggest privilege we have is genetic lottery. You talked about it earlier. And because of the genetic lottery or lack thereof, I do feel like subset of population, I don't know the percentage like you talked about, they're not predestined to fail, because that's very philosophical. But I think there is an innate ceiling to their capacity and their potential. And it's not their fault. It's truly genetic lottery. They are the victims to the circumstances of genetics that's much larger than any of us. And that's their external locus of control. And because of that, I do believe that we do need certain level of appropriate, well thought out policy interventions, because there will be always poverty. There will always be social stratification. We're tribal creatures. So there'll always be otherism and in-group bias. Those things are not going away. That's why I think the concepts in your book are timeless. But now obviously it's not popular to say, oh, I don't think poverty or homelessness. I think homelessness census in LA has surpassed 120,000 people.
Wow.
That's two
city.
football stadiums. That's a whole 20,000 people. And I don't think that homelessness will go away, right? We can pour all the money you want into shelters. One of the biggest spending in California is for homelessness, right? But there's a lot of corruptions, right? Delegations, contracts, and it's very, very muddy waters. But I don't think homelessness is solvable. Just like a lot of the societal illnesses, because homelessness is a societal ill. The people are not, but the phenomenon is a societal illness. I don't think those can be eradicated, because without addictions, there's no point to recovery. Without poverty, there's no point to prosperity. So I do feel like there are these innate things, mechanisms happening that's larger than we are. But it's definitely unpopular, but I truly believe that. That's why we need to do something about it, because we are self-aware about it. But I just wanted to share that with you.
No. I love that you share it. And the one thing that's really, that we both have these like views in common, we want people to do something about it. Like, you want to have a safety net for these individuals, as opposed to, and it requires pragmatism. I mean, I think this is one of the fundamental principles of being a rebel who's trying to improve systems and improve society and improve your personal life, is you have to look at the world as it is, like exactly as it is. And I think one of the things is when we are superficial, or we have a veneer of, we want this view to pervade how we think, and care more about how it shows where our identity lies in terms of what groups we're part of, as opposed to trying to fix a problem. That's a difficult, and you're seeing this with achievement tests, where, it's nobody likes achievement tests, and there's many ways of getting a better or worse score. But the thing is it's just data. And the idea of banning data because you think that it might lead to unfair treatment across groups, that's a question to test, not an ideological belief to uphold. And I think we have this view in common, which is, it's not as if we're robots. It's just more of, here's the things that we care about, and I need to figure out, where is it a problem? And also, where is it not a problem? Because if you say racism's everywhere, then it's not precise enough where we can make inroads. If you say everyone is creative, you haven't created a concept that has any value whatsoever. You're just seeing humans make things. And so you want that precision, because you want to solve problems and you want to improve society.
Yeah, thanks for bringing this all the way back to your book after a quick tangent. But yeah, we started the conversation with curiosity. You're aiming to appease the 80%, because that 20% disagreement leaves room for curiosity, and hopefully a call to action to discover more about what they agree with or disagree with. And you ended the conversation with also curiosity. I seek out more truth, hopefully scaffolding the discomfort beyond your conformed truth, because I think every crisis has an opportunity for change. But before this, I feel like I could talk to you for 6 more hours. So before that, without further ado, where can people check out your book, your website, your blogs, your education effort, anything in between?
You could find everything. All my books, you could download all my 250 papers for free, and then join my Substack, Provoked, right off of toddkashdan.com.
And I don't know if people can see, but the book is right in that little corner. I don't read every book that comes my way. I read them, but some of them I skim through. Some of them I do deep dive. But your book was one of the ones recently that I did a deep dive in, as you can probably tell. With that being said, I appreciate your time. I appreciate you going over time with me. Yeah, you're truly an independent thinker that appreciate the importance of nuances, and who also understand mental health as a through line.
I appreciate a psychologist who asks this many questions that are this deep over the course of an hour and a half. So thank you for the brain food. I need this for each weekend.
Hopefully this was worth skipping over your racquetball afternoon.
Absolutely. No question about it.
All right. So to all the listeners and viewers, if you have made it till this end, thank you. As you know, attention is the hardest commodity of nowadays. If you discover more something about to improve the quality of life, made you a little bit more curious today than an hour and a half before, please share this episode with one friend. It's free for you, but priceless for the podcast's growth. With that being said, I will leave all of Todd's information in the show notes below, and I urge you to join us in the next week's train of Discover More and choose curiosity over fear. And thank you for tuning in.